The story of humanity is so often told as a story of ascent, of monuments reaching for the sky, of towers that seem to scrape the clouds. Our history measured by what we have built up. But there is another history, a deeper one, written not in stone, but carved from it, in the silent, excavated darkness right beneath our feet. This isn't a story of conquest. It's a story of endurance, of a time that lasted for millennia, when the greatest measure of human strength was the ability to simply disappear.
The familiar narrative of human progress. It's almost always a story of an outward march, an expansion across open plains, over mountains that were thought to be impassable, and finally across vast unknown seas. But this chapter of our story, the one about expansion, well, it's a very recent one. It's really just a brief moment in the immense timeline of our existence. Because for most of human history, the primary direction of our species, it wasn't outward. It was the opposite. It was downward, into the earth, into the quiet, and into the dark.
Long before the first empires ever raised walls to keep their enemies out, entire societies were engineering worlds designed to keep themselves in. They weren't building defenses against the world, they were, in a very real sense, removing themselves from it entirely. And that's because they understood a fundamental, terrifying truth about their existence, that survival depended not on expansion, but on concealment. To endure the unthinkable forces of their world, they first had to become invisible.
To understand this instinct, this profound drive to retreat into the earth, one must first try to erase our modern conception of the world. One has to imagine a planet where the surface itself was an adversary. The world of our deep ancestors was not a tranquil place. It was a landscape of profound, unpredictable, and just unrelenting hostility. A world where to be seen was to be vulnerable.
To live on the surface was to live in a state of constant exposure, a life without walls, without any real guarantees. Every shadow at the edge of the firelight could hold a predator, patient and silent. Every distant horizon could bring a rival tribe, driven by the very same desperate needs for food and territory. But the greatest source of fear often came from the sky itself. It wasn't a predictable, benevolent force. No, it was a canvas of chaos, an engine of violence that could erase an entire generation in a single afternoon.
The climate of the ancient world wasn't a stable system. It was a series of chaotic, world-altering events. During the ice ages, massive sheets of ice would advance relentlessly, grinding entire landscapes into new forms, forcing all life to flee southward. Then, the planet would warm, and the retreat of that ice would cause catastrophic floods, literally rewriting coastlines. Volcanoes could erupt with such force they'd vomit ash into the stratosphere, blotting out the sun not for days, but for years, triggering a volcanic winter where temperatures would plummet and all plant life would just wither and die. And then there was the silence of drought, which could last for generations, turning once fertile valleys into cracked, lifeless dust. The very ground beneath their feet was never guaranteed. The dangers were layered, one right on top of the other. Beyond the immediate threat of apex predators that stalked the edges of every settlement, there was a greater, more organized danger: other humans. Nomadic raiding parties driven by hunger or by conquest could sweep across a landscape with terrifying speed, and in time, these would evolve into organized armies. For a small, settled community, the appearance of such a force on the horizon, it was a death sentence. There was no real defense. There was nothing to do but watch as everything that had been built was taken or destroyed. To live on the surface was to be perpetually, hopelessly vulnerable to forces far beyond anyone's control.
In the face of this overwhelming, unrelenting precarity, a decision was made. It wasn't a single decision, of course, made by one person in one moment. It was an instinct that grew over thousands of years, across cultures separated by entire continents. A decision so profound it represents a pivotal turn in the human story, every bit as important as the mastery of fire or the invention of the wheel. The decision was not to build higher walls, not to reach for the sky. It was to dig deeper, to consciously, deliberately leave the world of light and wind for the absolute stillness of the earth.
On the surface, you were exposed, vulnerable to the violent whims of both climate and conflict. Your entire existence was defined by instability. But just a few meters below that chaotic surface, the world was entirely different. Here, the temperature remained constant, cool in the searing summer and warm in the freezing winter. The absolute darkness offered a perfect shield, a cloak of invisibility. The earth itself provided a natural fortress. a shelter that no invading army could easily breach and no storm could ever shake. It was a world of constants in an age of variables. The instinct began simply enough, seeking refuge in a natural cave to wait out a passing storm or to hide from a prowling beast, a temporary solution. But over millennia, this simple act of seeking refuge evolved into something far more ambitious. Humans began to actively, intelligently shape the underworld. They were no longer just finding shelter, they were engineering survival on a permanent scale. With simple tools of stone and bone, they began to carve homes, then communal halls, then vast, interconnected cities from solid rock.
This was the ultimate defense strategy, one born not of aggression, but of profound patience. An invading army might arrive to find an empty valley, abandoned fields, silent, empty homes. There would be nothing for them to burn, nothing to conquer. The entire community, its people, its precious food stores, its livestock, its very future, would have simply vanished. They would have ceased to exist on the surface of the earth, leaving the invaders with nothing but a silent, confounding mystery.
This act of vanishing, it wasn't a panicked scramble into a hole in the ground. No, it was an act of incredible foresight, of planning, and of collective intelligence. To build and sustain a thriving world without sunlight, without open air, required a mastery of engineering, resource management, and social organization that really challenges our modern, often condescending assumptions about the primitive ancient mind. This was engineering in darkness.
Perhaps no place on Earth illustrates this forgotten chapter of human ingenuity better than the region of Cappadocia, in what is now Turkey. Here, the landscape is defined by the soft volcanic rock, known as tuff. Over thousands of years, ancient peoples discovered that this rock was easy to carve, yet it was stable. And so they began to dig. What they created was a network of hundreds of subterranean cities. The largest and deepest ever discovered is Dorinküyü. It is a staggering testament to a lost world of engineering. This is not a simple cave system, it is a metropolis, designed for the long-term habitation of up to 20,000 people.
To descend into Dorinküyü is to descend through layers of meticulous planning. The journey begins on the surface, with an entrance so well concealed it might be mistaken for an ordinary well or hidden within the courtyard of an unassuming house. The first, upper levels, the ones closest to the surface, were dedicated to the animals and to initial food storage. The smell of livestock would have been a deliberate mask for the human life that was thriving below. Descending deeper, the passages open into communal halls, living quarters, shared kitchens, even wineries and chapels for religious observance. And then, at the deepest, most protected levels, you find the city's lifeblood, shafts that reached all the way down to the clean water of the aquifer, armories for defense, and the final escape routes. Every level was another layer of security.
But this all raises a fundamental question. How could 20,000 people, along with their animals, live and breathe, some as deep as 85 meters below the ground? The air should have become toxic within just a few days. The answer lies in the city's most brilliant and critical piece of infrastructure, the ventilation shafts. These were not just simple holes poked through the rock. They were massive vertical channels, some over 50 meters deep, meticulously engineered and carved to ensure a constant passive flow of fresh air from the surface down to every single level of the city. This network of shafts acted as the city's lung. Cooler, denser air from the surface would sink down the central shafts, while the warmer, smoky air from cooking fires in human bodies would naturally rise and exit through others. This constant circulation, driven by simple physics, allowed the entire subterranean world to inhale and exhale. It meant fires could be lit for cooking and warmth without asphyxiating the population. This was a complex problem of fluid dynamics and airflow, solved thousands of years ago with simple tools and an intimate, lived understanding of the Earth itself.
Every single feature of the city's architecture was born from the necessities of survival and the psychology of fear. At critical junctions between levels, they carved these massive circular stone doors, almost like millstones, weighing several tons. These could only be rolled into place from the inside, sealing a corridor completely. The main tunnels were often kept intentionally narrow and low, a brilliant defensive design that would force any invading soldier to crouch and advance one at a time, making them easy targets for defenders waiting in the darkness. This was an architecture of paranoia, and the knowledge to build and maintain these spaces was a sacred trust, passed down through generations who knew their very lives depended on it.
But the engineering challenges, as immense as they were really only half the battle. The other, perhaps greater challenge was psychological. How does the human mind cope with the complete absence of the sky? How does a community endure for months, perhaps even years, in a sealed world of stone and perpetual shadow?
To survive, they had to achieve a profound reshaping of the human experience itself. They had to build a new kind of community, a sealed community.
Just consider what was lost. The daily rhythm of sunrise and sunset, the monthly cycles of the moon, the slow, reassuring turning of the seasons, all of it gone. In this timeless, unchanging environment, how does a community function? How do you organize work and rest and ritual? How does an individual mind, one that evolved for the open spaces of the surface, stay sane in the eternal twilight? How is time measured without a sun?
The answer was absolute structure. In the absence of natural rhythms, humans created their own. Life underground was governed by an ironclad social order. Shared beliefs, strict rules, and meticulously followed communal routines, they became the new sun. The lighting of lamps, the grinding of grain, the periods of shared silence. These artificial cycles provided the rhythm that the sky no longer could. Survival in this sealed environment depended not just on the strength of their stone walls, but on the unwavering strength of their social cohesion. A single act of rebellion could threaten the entire community.
In the echoing stone corridors, sound behaved differently. It traveled, it was amplified in unpredictable ways. A careless shout, the cry of a child, the clumsy fall of a tool, any one of these could travel up a ventilation shaft to the surface, alerting a listening enemy to the presence of life below. So, silence became a form of defense, a communal discipline practiced by every man, woman, and child. They learned to move quietly, to speak in low voices, to live with a constant awareness of the sounds they were making. Silence became survival. The entire sensory world was inverted. On the surface, sight is our dominant sense, accustomed to expansive horizons and the cycles of day and night. But below ground, in the near total darkness, sight became secondary, hearing became paramount. People learned to navigate and understand their world through sound, to read the meaning of a distant footstep, the echo of a voice down a long corridor, the vital, rhythmic drip of water into a cistern. Your world shrank from the vast horizon to the tiny, flickering circle at the end of your torchlight. And time itself began to warp, measured not by the passage of the sun, but by the slow, steady burning of oil in a lamp.
And what is perhaps most remarkable is that this impulse, this profound decision to retreat into the earth when the surface world became unbearable, was not a regional anomaly. It wasn't unique to the people of Cappadocia. It appears across the globe, in different cultures, in different geological settings, at different times. It is an echo of a shared, fundamental human response to existential threat. It's a global instinct.
On the lowest plateau in China, for instance, millions of people lived in dwellings known as yadong, carved into the cliff sides to escape the region's brutally extreme summer heat and winter cold. In ancient Persia, entire cities were engineered underground as a dual defense against both invaders and the scorching, life-threatening heat of the desert sun. And on the island of Malta, the hypogeum, a complex subterranean structure carved from limestone over 5,000 years ago, suggests a world built not just for physical survival, but for deep ritual and community life in the dark. From Anatolia to China, Malta to Persia, each culture adapted to its own specific threat. But the fundamental solution? It was always the same. Go down.
It seems that when faced with overwhelming extinction-level danger, a deep, collective memory surfaced within our species. The shared human instinct, honed by millennia of precarious survival on a hostile planet, pointed in one unambiguous direction: down. It was an impulse as fundamental as seeking water when thirsty or building a fire against the cold. It was the wisdom of retreat, coded into our very being.
And yet, here we are today, living on the surface. These great subterranean cities, once teeming with tens of thousands of people, are now silent. They're empty relics visited by tourists. This raises a final, crucial question. Why did we leave? The story of their abandonment, the story of the long ascent back into the light, it's just as important as the story of their creation.
It is crucial to understand this point. These were not failed civilizations. Their silence is not a testament to some final, catastrophic collapse. On the contrary, the emptiness of these cities is the ultimate sign of their profound success. They weren't built to last forever. They were built to last long enough.
These subterranean worlds were created as a direct response to the instability of the surface. And so, they were abandoned because surface conditions finally stabilized. When the waves of invasion ceased, when the climate settled into a more predictable pattern, when agriculture could be reliably practiced in the open sunlight once more, their purpose was fulfilled. The great long-running threat had passed. It was, at long last, safe to emerge.
These forgotten worlds are a library of human endurance, storing a kind of wisdom we have largely forgotten. They tell us that our ancestors were not just brave fighters and clever hunters, they were also patient waiters. They possessed a profound understanding that some storms are just too powerful to be weathered in the open. They had the collective wisdom to retreat, the incredible intelligence to engineer a functional world in the dark, and most of all, the deep generational patience to wait for the light to return.
This is perhaps the most profound lesson that the subterranean cities have to teach us. That survival is not always about confrontation. That progress is not always about expansion. It shows us that there is a deep, ancient, and powerful strength in retreat, in concealment, in the quiet, stubborn refusal to be extinguished. When extinction loomed, humans did not always fight. Sometimes they endured by disappearing. It's the strategy of the seed, which waits through the long, dark winter, buried and forgotten, until the conditions are finally right to rise again into the sun.
These cities are a silent monument to a forgotten truth, that our species has survived not only by climbing the highest mountains, but by having the wisdom to hollow them out from within. Humanity learned to survive the unthinkable by retreating into the earth. By mastering the darkness, they ensured that their descendants, us, would one day be able to emerge and live, once again, in the full light of the sun.